Good evening and welcome to the 4th Annual Diversity Summit at the George Washington University. My name is Carolyn Laguerre-Brown, and I'm the Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement here at GW. It's a privilege to be with you this evening as we kick off the Diversity Summit. Over the last few months, members of the Diversity Summit Committee have put in a significant amount of time, effort, and work to provide you with an educational experience that invites you to bring your full selves into each and every space in order to think in a more deep and more complex way about the many, many issues that we are attempting to grapple with. We shifted the timing of the Diversity Summit from spring to fall, and we hope this affords us the opportunity to take all of the learning that we have in the next couple of days and translate that into our current practice and our actions right here on campus. Through the vision of the Diversity Summit, I'm confident that we will discover more about ourselves, will understand the lived experiences of others, and determine new ways to build a more inclusive GW on an individual and communal level. We have a wonderful opportunity over the next 24 hours to challenge ourselves to leave the summit tomorrow differently than when we began. We would love for you to allow yourselves to stretch a little more, to find out something new about yourself, and perhaps connect with a peer or colleague who comes to GW with a completely different life story than yours. Decide who you want to be when you leave this experience and how you will take the moments with you to create a more powerful, more meaningful, and important change on this campus and in the world. Whether you choose to attend a session on Latinx students, tools for navigating triggering events on campus, our lunch panel on academic freedom and inclusion, a session on the campus climate for LGBTQIA+ students, perhaps a session on religious diversity in higher education, or maybe the closing performance tomorrow evening, which will be a powerful and breathtaking experience. Just make sure that you choose. Nothing is more important in this moment than being present, showing up, and gifting yourself the time to learn and to grow. I'm excited for you, and I hope this experience has a lasting impact on who you are as a GW community member and a global citizen. I look forward to meeting you, reconnecting, and learning together over the course of the next day. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce the 17th president of the George Washington University. Please join me in welcoming President Tom LeBlanc.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you to the entire planning committee for the work that you've done. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for this wonderful event and to welcome you to GW's 4th Annual Diversity Summit. It's our hope that this event will provide a space for members of the GW community to engage in meaningful conversations about race and racism, bias, sexuality and gender, and religion, faith, spirituality and beliefs, and much more. This space seems more important than ever right now. All you need to do is turn on the news to get a sense of the kind of challenging climate in which we currently live. What we are witnessing is, in many places, a climate of intolerance and ignorance, hateful rhetoric, and horrific violence that runs counter to the values we at GW seek to uphold every day. We stand for building a strong community in service of our shared purpose and mission. We stand for embracing the unique contributions of all members of that community. And we stand for treating others with courtesy, dignity, and respect. GW and each one of us must be a role model in encompassing these and other values. Beyond living up to our values, we know that diversity is essential in achieving excellence. And we cannot be a preeminent university without embracing diversity and inclusion. Over the last year, GW has tried to grow in those areas. We heard very clearly that we needed to do more to foster a welcoming and inclusive environment on our campus. In the spring, we created an action response report with students, staff, and faculty. And as part of this response, we hired the first director of diversity and inclusion education. At Colonial inauguration, new students participated in conversations aimed at the understanding what it means to be a part of a diverse community. They also learned about GW's community values and expectations. In addition, we provided unconscious bias training for all new faculty and academic leaders, and we implemented new policies related to discrimination and harassment. We also created an online diversity training program for students that will launch this month. And those are just a few of the actions we have taken. There are several more laid out in the report. All of these actions and this very summit signal our shared commitment that we accept one another, that we embrace our individual differences, and that we seek to understand how those differences make us stronger collectively. I encourage you to stay engaged, to have conversations and lean into all that is offered over the next day here at the summit. Your participation is a critical step helping us make progress on diversity and inclusion at GW. I look forward to continue working with you toward a more inclusive campus community here at GW. And with that, I am now honored to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. Jemele Hill is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, the co-founder of the Lodge Freeway Media, and a staff writer for The Atlantic. Ms. Hill graciously held the roles previously and graciously, held the roles of chief correspondent and senior columnist for The Undefeated, ESPN's website platform exploring the interactions of sports, race, and culture. Prior to joining The Undefeated, Ms. Hill co-anchored SportsCenter. I also recall watching her on The Sports Reporter and was very disappointed when that show ended. I've been a big fan of hers for years as I've seen her career progress, and I couldn't believe it when I found out that she was going to be here as a part of our Diversity Summit. Earlier this year, the National Association of Black Journalists awarded Ms. Hill with Journalist of the Year Award. She is thoughtful, she is woke, she is here, and I would ask you to join me in welcoming a big GW welcome to Jemele Hill. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Now everybody's a little disappointed I didn't come up here with a dashiki and a fist raised in the air since I am woke. Thank you all for having me here. I felt a little ashamed because I had never been over here to GW, and I, up until a couple of weeks ago, actually was living here in DC. But now I'm in Los Angeles, and it was no indictment of DC, but unfortunately I only got a chance to spend a cup of coffee here, so I didn't get an opportunity to come to this university or in many ways really experience what this city has to offer. I'm gonna let you guys in on a little secret, and if you say that I said it, I'm gonna deny it, even though I see these cameras back there, so I guess you can sort of replay it if you wanted to, but journalists are really saps. And we're really idealist and optimist, despite the fact that you see us often take pessimistic positions. And the reason I say that is because, at least when I first got into the business and as I was thinking about journalism as a full-fledged career, the reasons I got into it, none had to do with fame, none had to do with money. None had to do with being on television or seeing my byline or any of the sort of narcissistic trappings that come along sometimes if you're a journalist elevated into a high position. I got into it to find the truth and to tell stories. And even though I was doing that through the lens of sports, I thought sports in many ways, because it had been often at the forefront of certain societal issues before society had caught up. Because if you think about it, Jackie Robinson, he integrated Major League Baseball in 1947. That was almost 20 years before the Civil Rights Act actually passed. And so sports was always giving us these opportunities to become the type of society that we wanted to be, to have the things that we thought our society should represent, being as close to a meritocracy as we thought we could get. So I got into it for a really simple reason. And I think that's important, especially in today's climate, that we remember why journalists essentially decided to do this job. Because a lot of times when we think about the things that we become aware of, when we think about the things that have been shed light on, especially now when journalism and journalists seem to be under attack, even by our very own government, it's more important than ever. And I'm of the belief that if you love something, that if you really care about it, and if you want it to be better, you also have to be critical of it as well. So one of the things that I certainly am critical of when it comes to journalism is what our profession looks like now, and what, unfortunately, it has always looked like for the last 20 years that I have been in this business. There have been opportunities there, great opportunities that I feel like journalists have taken advantage of in terms of educating the public and moving us forward and making us aware of maybe some of the dangers that lie, particularly when it comes to misinformation. I'm thinking now, as we all are, about these midterm elections, and there's a lot of information out there, a lot of misinformation. You know, probably one of the most racist political ads I think I've ever seen, and I am old enough to remember the Willie Horton ad, was released by our president, forcing journalists, again, to take a role in fact-checking and trying to tamper down ignorance. But even thinking about these midterm elections, I hear a lot of young people especially talk about how they feel like their vote and their voice doesn't matter, that it's being drowned out today. So I took a look at two of the more important races that we're seeing now. The race in Florida between Andrew Gillum and Ron DeSantis. Right now, at least as of the current polling, even though it's still in the early voting phase with the vote to take place next week, or ending next week, I should say. Right now, Andrew Gillum has 45% of the vote, and Ron DeSantis has 44%. Obviously, that's a very slim margin. 8% remain undecided. Pretty much everybody in Florida is voting along state lines. I look at Stacey Abrams' race against Brian Kemp. Yeah, Oprah was in Georgia today. I was like, wow, knocking on people's doors. You imagine opening your doors, see Oprah there? Like, that would be something. So right now, as of the sort of early tally that they have, Stacey Abrams has 48.1% of the vote, and Brian Kemp has 47.1% of the vote. Now, a big story that has emerged the last few years, but particularly important now that these midterm elections are taking shape, is voter suppression. I don't know if you all remember this. 1993, I remember this not just because this was the year I graduated from high school, so you know now how old I am, but that was also the year that the Supreme Court revised the National Voter Registration Act. And the reason why this sort of came to light is because of some of the efforts in Georgia that have gone on in terms of suppressing voters or clamping down on voter rights. So Brian Kemp was able to send postcards to eligible voters that sort of looked like spam. I'm sure some of you have seen these little postcards, maybe not about votes, but these spam postcards you get, some of which tell you that, you know, you've won a sweepstakes and you'll be paid $1,000 for 20 years for the rest of your life if you send it back, or maybe you'll get a great interest rate on a new Hyundai. So you know what these spam cards kind of look like. So they were sent to voters, and if you didn't return the postcard, you were removed from the registered voter roll. The number of votes that were, or voters, I should say, that were removed from the Georgia roll was 340,000. Now, I'm sure a lot of people hear that number, and I heard the whistle, so that was my sort of indication too. But an investigative journalist decided to take it a step further, seeing that number, and requested the entire log of all these voters that had been removed from the voter roll. Because this journalist wanted to find out, were these people who just moved away? Did they just not want to vote? I mean, just to get to the root of, was this a conspiracy, or was this just a byproduct of people moving around and not keeping up with their voter registration? And as it turns out, the majority of these voters, A, were African American, B, were Democrat, and C, they hadn't moved, that they were just literally kicked off. And he was allowed to do that. And not only that, of course, you have the conflict of interest of him being Secretary of State and running for governor in the state as well. So you have that inherent conflict. So this is all being fleshed out and discovered by journalists, which, again, brings to light just how important of a function we can have in today's society. It also made me think about my own voting experience recently, last week. One of the questions I often get is, how has my life been impacted since I had those tweets about the president. Well, normally I usually say something along the lines of, more people know me, the hate mail is a little more specific. Volume of it has certainly increased and, some other things. But it really brought into focus not just how much my life had changed, but how much that had put me in the crosshairs of certain people. So I've been a registered Florida voter since 2005. That's when I moved to Florida, and I maintained a permanent residence there despite the fact I've had to live in other cities. Totally legal to do that, by the way. So seeing all the things that were happening with voter suppression, I decided this year in particular for the midterms, rather than send in an absentee ballot, which I did for the presidential election in 2016, that I was going to make an in-person appearance and go and vote so that way I would feel at ease and not paranoid about what might have happened to my vote. So before I left for Florida, I checked the voter roll twice to make sure that I was registered to vote, and I was. So I go to the polling place, library that's maybe 15 minutes from my house, and they look up my name, and I am not on the voter roll. And I thought it might have just been a mistake and just some confusion as they continued to try to dig to figure out the problem. Still wasn't on the roll. So next thing I know, phone calls are being made, and they deserve a lot of credit because they really did try to get to the bottom of this. And ultimately, the decision was made to just let me fill out a provisional ballot, which I did. I filled out a provisional ballot. They gave me a little slip that said how I can track my vote. Of course, I left there not feeling real comfortable with that situation and wondering how in the world am I off the voter roll. So about 45 minutes after I left the polling place, I get a call from somebody from the supervisor of elections, somebody I do not know and had never spoken to. And he said to me, do you know, did they explain to you what happened? I said, no, I had no idea. I'm thinking it's some kind of mistake, clerical error. But I can tell you I have mail that's in here. This is a permanent residence. No one else has ever lived in this house. This is my house. He said, well, you made a social media post last week about voting. And I said, yeah, I sure did. And by the way, I should say he prefaced this whole conversation by telling me he was a really big fan and that he would see me on TV. He also loves sports reporters. So yeah, he, I guess, wanted me to know that this was not coming from a place necessarily of him being biased against me. So he said, well, that post was brought to our attention. And I will share with you what was in that Instagram post. So in the post, I mentioned how I had recently moved to Los Angeles and that I was flying to Florida because I wanted to vote. And yes, I did say that I wanted to support candidate Andrew Gillum, but that in general, I don't care who you vote for, just vote. This is your opportunity to make your voice heard. So he said that post had been sent in to the electorate, the election supervisors there. And that's how it came across their attention. And the term that he used in describing who alerted them, who snitched that I was somehow committing voter fraud, was Red Brigade, which was an interesting term to use because I think you can all figure out who this was coming from. I found it to be even more interesting that we're now using Instagram posts to determine whether or not somebody is eligible to vote. So he apologized. He said that he thought I would eventually be in the clear, that he would check back in with me. And, it was a good conversation, but very alarming in the context of today, because I do wonder, had I written a post where I said that I was supporting Ron DeSantis, if indeed I would have been kicked off the Florida voter roll? My guess is no. And it brought into focus, especially now, not only how much my life had changed, and I can connect the dots in terms of my criticisms of the president and how that might have led to this moment, but not only how much my life had changed, but exactly what's at stake out here and how journalists need to be covering it. The disappointing part about all of this is that I'm not sure that journalism today is equipped to cover some of the stories that have become so important and integral to our lives. The reason why I say that is because in order for journalism and media to cover these stories, we have to shed a light on a very significant problem that's in our business right now. It's actually two significant problems. One is our ability to tell the truth, which is being compromised on an hourly basis, and our problems when it comes to diversity. I'm going to give you some very scary figures about American newsrooms. Based on 2017, those figures, just 1 in 6 American newsroom employees are racial minorities. 1 in 6. The American Society of Newspaper Editors say that minorities comprise about 16.6% of the workforce. In online-only news organizations, that number is 24.3%. Now, that's obviously some very awful numbers. Now, these are the newsrooms that are in charge of covering a world that has changed so much from a racial standpoint, from a cultural standpoint. They can't even reflect what they're covering or understand the issues happening in various communities, issues like voter suppression, when your newsrooms are almost overwhelmingly white. Not that only people of color can understand voter suppression, but just to say that if you're going to cover underrepresented communities, your newsroom should look a lot different. Now, these numbers look even worse in the field of sports media. 85% of sports editors are white men. 77% of assistant sports editors are white men. 80% of columnists are white men. 82% of sports reporters overall are white men. 78% of copy editors and designers are white men. Now, last year, the percentage of people of color that were in sports media improved just slightly. The percentage of women in sports media did not. Now, this is what those numbers look like if you take ESPN out of it, because ESPN, as obviously being the leader in terms of sports media, having, I'm sure as you all have watched the network, seeing a lot of diverse faces. If you removed ESPN from those numbers that I just read you, this is what things would look like. So there are 44 female sports columnists now in the country. 38 of them work at ESPN, meaning outside of there's only 6 outside of ESPN. Now, of those 44 female sports columnists, 11 of them are women of color. All of them work at ESPN, which means that outside of ESPN, there is not one woman of color that's a sports columnist in America. Now, that especially resonates with me because I became a sports columnist in 2005 when I worked at the Orlando Sentinel. At the time, I was the only Black female sports columnist in North America at a daily newspaper. And notice I didn't say America, I said North America. 1 out of 305. That is an embarrassing statistic by any measure. A lot of people said when I told them that, oh, well, you should be proud because you stand out. I said, no, I'm not proud. I don't want to be the only one that is a sports columnist in this country. Like, as much as I know that I'm a pretty good writer, I'm not that good where I'm the only one capable of holding that position. So again, how is the media supposed to cover people of color when they don't have any of them or hardly any of them represented in their own newsrooms? How can they substantially or even speak to any of these issues? And you can see how it impacts coverage on a daily basis. Again, I'll just keep it to sports because in many ways that's my primary expertise. Because of a newsroom that isn't very diverse or sports media that isn't very diverse, that's why Colin Kaepernick's peaceful protest turns into a conversation about patriotism rather than about police brutality. On a wider scale, this is why in media there is a struggle to call Donald Trump a liar when he doesn't tell the truth. It's not about him being inaccurate. It's not that he's wrong. He's just flat out lying. That's what happens when your newsrooms look the way that they do. These days, the press avoids certain words I notice in coverage and in headlines. Terms like white supremacists, white nationalists, ethnic cleansing, Nazi sympathizers, domestic terrorists. Those are all seemingly words that are avoided because there's too much hand-wringing in newsrooms about calling things what they are. The whole basis of our profession is supposed to be truth. If we can't tell the truth, then we have not only lost our credibility, we've lost your trust. Because the bottom line is you can't serve the people and protect the establishment. Those two do not go together. It's already extremely challenging for people of color in this business, but with all the pessimistic things I just told you, let me also use that as an encouragement, a plea to you for those who want to be in media or desire to have journalistic careers, especially if you're a woman, especially if you are a woman of color, that despite what the newsroom looks like right now, I need you to stay in it. There's a lot of us that are leaving the business because they're frustrated, because the opportunities aren't there, because the advancement isn't there. And while I know at times that it may seem as if this industry is not going to change, and I have these thoughts myself because in the 21 years I've been in this business, the progress has been glacial, painful, and slow. But nevertheless, there are victories that are in there. I think about my own career and where I have been able to accomplish and the platforms I have been able to have. And these were not platforms or opportunities that existed for people who look like me 10 or 15 years ago. We can't afford to have stories told by people who don't have the understanding or the bandwidth to tell these stories. There's a reason why now all of a sudden you see all these athletes creating production companies and getting into media. It's because they're tired of going into locker rooms and seeing no one in these locker rooms that looks like them. They're tired of their story being told by no one that looks like them. So they decided to create their own narratives and to tell their own stories. For as much as there are many reasons now, especially today, to not be in this business, there's a whole lot of reasons, I think, to be in this business. And so as much as I sometimes, from a day-to-day basis, wake up and wonder, have the stupid people won today? And they do win a lot of days, let me tell you. Today, maybe not. Yesterday, they definitely won. As much as that is the case, I'm reminded as somebody who grew up reading comic books, who does love the Marvel movies, and now people really believe me because I'm not working for Disney anymore, so I'm not being a company shill. Obviously, I don't work there anymore. I look at some of the great comic book figures and superheroes. There's a reason why so many of them were journalists. Superman was a journalist. Even though I often laugh at the fact that he's in a newsroom with people who are nosy and curious, and yet nobody understood the glasses thing. Nobody got to the bottom of that, nevertheless. Spider-Man was a photojournalist, which means that there is a nobility about this profession that still means something, be it in the fictional world or the actual real world. In closing, I want you all to remember two things. Bad things happen when good people do nothing. And I think we're seeing an example of that on a day-to-day basis. At this point in our country and in our climate, to be silent is to be complicit. You cannot afford to be silent because you wake up and you see all these things happening. And it's like the crazy scientist that tried to warn everybody the world was ending or that, the big iceberg was coming and nobody listened. You don't want to be the person not listening or staying silent. And I'll leave you with this quote from Ida B. Wells, who to me is maybe the greatest journalist of all time, especially for her work in bringing to light lynchings in the South, her investigative reporting that often put her own life at risk. Ida B. Wells said, "I'd rather go down in history as one lone Negro who dared to tell the government that it had done a dastardly thing than to save my skin by taking back what I said." Thank you all.
So, good evening, everyone. My name is Jordan West. I am the Director of Diversity and Inclusion Education, and I just welcome you all and ask that you give one more thank you to Jemele Hill for being here today. So So we have some time set aside for Q&A. We're going to begin with just a moderation of questions that Jemele and I will go through, and then we will have a microphone brought to the middle. So we invite you to think about your questions. We also invite you to tweet your questions. You'll see that there's a hashtag here, and we really want to engage with you. This is the beginning of the Diversity Summit, and for many of you, you know that Jemele is very active on Twitter, so tag her, at her, make sure that you're engaging back with not only your colleagues and your peers in this room, but also Jemele Hill. So thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things that the Diversity Summit is prioritizing is having intentional conversations about race and really identity as a whole. We're asking students and our colleagues here at GW to bring their full selves. So would you share with us how you think about race and your identity on a daily basis? I think you offered it in some ways, but maybe explicitly naming that.
Well, I'm glad you used that term, your full selves, because a lot of times, especially as someone who up until recently spent the majority of their career in corporate America, it does not exactly invite you to have your full self at work. Mm-hmm. And at least the way I think about it is that I know a lot of people look at race and they feel like it's supposed to be something that separates us from one another. Mm-hmm. But while it may separate us just from a cultural standpoint and a background standpoint, we have so much more alike than we do different. And there's a difference between using racial identity to divide and appreciating racial differences. There's no harm in appreciating what you can get and take from different cultures, not from an appropriation standpoint, but how you can appreciate the authenticity in every culture. Mm-hmm. So for me, race is a part of who I am. Being a Black woman in this country, there's obviously a different perspective I may have than from other people. And I feel like that's something that is to be contributed and benefited from, as opposed to be used as an excuse to suppress or diminish or downplay. Mm-hmm. So I just look at, while the fact that we are a quote unquote melting pot as a country, but I think it's our differences and, these very unique sort of themes and strands in every culture. I think that's what sets us apart, and that's what makes us special, and that's also what bonds us together.
Mm-hmm, sure, thank you. So when you think about the ways in which you created what I would call maybe a platform, perhaps you have a different word for it, but this idea of being on social media as actively as you are, being in the media, how have you been intentional about creating your image? Some people might call it a brand, some people might not, but how have you been really strategic about that?
Well, I have never had one conversation about my image or my brand with myself. In fact, I've never done it. I mean, I don't give that much thought to it. And often, especially now, I have a lot of aspiring young journalists that come up to me and they say, I want to promote my brand and what kind of brand should I have? And I always tell them the same thing. How are you going to have a brand without a product? Mm. You can't do that. Like, what is your brand? Mm-hmm. There's no brand. It's your work. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. Mm-hmm. So everything that I do is about my work. Mm-hmm. I got to this point not because I said, okay, you know what? In 2017, I'm going to tweet about the president, and then that's going to take my career in this direction. No, everything has been about me doing those two simple things that are part of our profession, pursuing the truth and telling stories. That was it. Mm-hmm. And who I am on Twitter is just me being me. I mean, Twitter, or social media, period, not just Twitter. I take it in the intent in which it was meant. It doesn't define me. Generally speaking, I don't care what people say about me on there. But I do think it's a great way to interact with people. I love the fact that it's exposed me to many more writers and thought leaders than I think I ever would have been exposed to. So that's the really good part about it. But I don't go on these social media platforms or really do anything with the intention of trying to put forth some kind of representative of who I am. Mm-hmm. You get me all the time. Mm-hmm. The only difference between now and maybe when I have some Pinot Noir is that you'll get a lot more cursing. That's it. But I'm the same person around the clock. And what I tend to find, especially in our business, the people who are playing roles, who are caricatures, those people do not last.
So in the context of social media, some people might say you took a risk with that tweet about the president. In the context of higher education, I think we're always encouraging students, especially, to create their voice, find their voice, use their voice. We've seen an increase in student activism, not only at GW, but across higher education. Talk to us a little bit about voice. You recently put out a tweet around pushing your narrative, making sure that people are pushing their narratives through. So, you think about the risk you might have taken to tweet to Donald Trump, but something about your voice was in there. You found your voice and maybe some sense of confidence, I'm not sure.
Well, one, I didn't at the president. I was like at real Donald Trump. You a white supremacist, like that never happened. I was in a conversation with somebody who was trying to defend what he said after Charlottesville. And like a lot of people, I was very disturbed that you had somebody in that position in office who could not do the easiest thing in the world, which is to denounce white nationalism and Nazis and white supremacists. Like, that's a layup. That's pretty easy to do. But yet there was a struggle there. And so those tweets came mostly out of frustration. And I didn't actually think they were controversial at all. I wasn't the first person who said it. I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an entire article about, a very thoughtful, critical article about the president being a white supremacist. So it was not a hot take. And it was the equivalent of saying water is wet. So when it galvanized into what it did, I was just as surprised as anybody. I didn't think people were really paying attention. I knew I had a lot of followers, don't get me wrong, but when you're in the reply mode, I wasn't thinking that these tweets were going to all of a sudden make their way to the White House briefing room. So for me, it was something that I have always done, which is tell the truth and be authentic, and especially when you feel like you're on the right side of history. There was no wavering to be had. I wasn't, thinking like, oh, these tweets are going to become this. It was just simply me just being who I am.
So I want to read a quote that I think was captured in a recent article for Beto O'Rourke. It said, "Nonviolently, peacefully, while the eyes of this country are watching these games, they take a knee to bring our attention and our focus to this problem to ensure that we fix it. That is why they are doing it. And I can think of nothing more American than to peacefully stand up or take a knee for your rights, anytime, anywhere, in any place." So in the context of your work, what does this quote mean to you? And what would this quote mean, or how would you translate it to maybe our audience, which is the context of higher education?
Well, so people understand, this was Beto O'Rourke, his response when he was at a town hall in Houston. And that town hall was actually supposed to be mostly centered on education and healthcare. And out of nowhere, somebody asked him how he felt about NFL players protesting, kneeling during the national anthem. And that was his response. As many of you probably have seen and have heard, over the last couple of years since Colin Kaepernick decided to take a knee in 2016, the original reason why he decided to do it has been completely overshadowed and lost, and it's not really even discussed. As I mentioned there on the podium, it's all of a sudden become a conversation about patriotism. And Beto O'Rourke is one of the few in his position with what he has at stake in the race against Ted Cruz to actually answer this question thoughtfully, honestly, and critically. He understood that this was about police brutality. This was not about patriotism. And I think what his response indicated was he had a full understanding of the issue. And the people that I've talked to that disagree with Colin or any of the other NFL players, I've often said this to them, is that if they were kneeling for domestic violence, would you have this problem? And most of them would not. So it gets back to what it's always been about. And that is that the people who are usually against these protests don't think that police brutality is actually a problem. And, it sounds harsh to say it that way, I know, to a lot of people. But whenever athletes and even me are told to stick to sports or, as the documentary I'm narrating, the title says, "Shut Up and Dribble." The reason they are is because of what they're saying, not necessarily where they're doing it. And so, in the terms of higher education, I mean, I think, this is where you all have such a great and incredible opportunity. The very setup that you have is to increase critical thinking, is to increase thought, to increase disruption. And it's at least heartwarming for me to see that that is taking place at an astounding number of campuses. I go to colleges all the time, and I'm very encouraged by the level of activism, activation, and just students wanting to be involved and not wanting to be silent and not wanting to be complicit in terms of what they're saying right now. So what he said, it was just a great entryway and an entry point for people to understand what this protest was actually about. And not to mention, personally, I think that answer, because it went viral, is the whole reason he became a national superstar. Because that kind of honesty is rare from a politician. And after that, LeBron James tweeted him, and Ellen DeGeneres had him on her show, and he became sort of, in that moment, I know some people had just been looking at him as a candidate for senator. In that moment, people were suddenly seeing, like, this guy might be president one day.
Yeah. So I want to encourage the audience members to begin maybe forming a line. I'll ask one more question, and then we can, you're really ready. That's great.
No.
So I'll ask one more question as folks start to form around. And I'd ask that the line stay as close to the microphone and that side as possible. So you mentioned Shut Up and Dribble. It's an exciting opportunity that you have with Showtime. It begins this weekend, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Can you share with us what you're hoping to communicate through this?
I'm hoping what will happen is that people will understand that whether it be Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, LeBron James, that in some way, shape, or form, Black athletes have always been told to shut up and dribble. And that theme has not really changed that much, even though the circumstances and, social policy has certainly progressed since the days of Bill Russell, when he couldn't even eat in the dining rooms with his own teammates because of segregation. That part of it may have changed. How Black athletes are viewed and criticized and often told to stay in their place has remained. And I think, what a lot of people will walk away from this feeling beyond just that is that, or rather the takeaways they'll have is understanding that as much as and as fresh as things feel now, this has happened before. And, I know we often have that adage about learning from history. When you see these three parts of Shut Up and Dribble, you'll know we do not learn from history. We rarely seem to learn from history. It's just an interesting kind of juxtaposition, because the NBA right now is considered to be the thoughtful, more progressive, encouraging league when it comes to player activism and encouraging players to speak out on social issues. But before there was Colin Kaepernick, there was a guy named Craig Hodges, who was a guard for the Chicago Bulls and wore a dashiki to the White House when the Bulls won after their 72-win season. And he's handed a letter to George Sr. asking him to help bring aid and resources to inner cities. And Craig Hodges never played in the NBA again after that. He was blackballed. And I remember when that happened, but I had forgotten when he competed in the three-point contest to defend his title. He had to do it with a generic jersey that said NBA on it, because no one ever contacted him after he did that at the White House. After Craig Hodges, there was a guy named Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf who turned his back to the national anthem whenever it played in arenas. They burned his house down. He didn't play in the NBA much longer after that protest. He also was blackballed. So there's, again, this consistent pattern of silencing people of color, especially when they consider that you have it, quote unquote, better than the rest of us. That's when you really get told to be quiet, because the general insinuation is, don't you have it good enough? What are you complaining about? And so anyway, I think you guys will enjoy it. The footage in it is truly amazing. And for people who live through it, even in real time, there are some nuances and things that you probably miss. So I hope you guys enjoy it.
Thank you. So I want to invite, go ahead, yeah, you're ready.
I'm ready.
So if you would mind saying your name, providing anything you want to share, and then asking your question.
Okay, so my name is Naima Rakib. I work here at GW in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. I just have a statement about sports journalism that has bothered me, sometimes the commentating. And I want to know how you feel. When you look at a sports game or a gymnast or anything, it's like their mom was on crack, or they'll say they were home. Like they'll take the worst part about their life or the perceived worst part about their life, and for some reason they'll bring it up in sports. And at that moment, it doesn't seem to relate. Sometimes I've heard they're not even raised by that person, but yet they bring up this history of these negative things, and it tends to be Black athletes. So I just wanted to see how you thought about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's been an issue in our industry, not just in bringing up unrelated facts about how they were raised or, their parents or background, but also just in the way that they discuss their abilities. One of the parts of Shut Up and Dribble that is very eye-opening and stark, and I'm sure you guys will really focus in on it, but when the Celtics and Pistons played in the late 80s, I think it was Dennis Rodman who said first that if Larry Bird were Black, he'd be just another player. And Isaiah Thomas kind of defended Dennis Rodman's statements. Now, obviously, Larry Bird is extremely talented, so that's not what this was about. But as Isaiah later came to explain, his issue wasn't that he didn't think that Larry Bird was talented. His issue was the fact that whenever commentators discussed Larry Bird or whenever he was written about, they would talk about how hardworking he is, where he was from, his values. And it almost insinuated that Black athletes didn't work as hard as Larry Bird. And Isaiah Thomas took issue with that. And a lot of times when I hear commentating, even today, it's under the vein of Black athletes having just hit the genetic lottery, not actually being smart or good at what they do. LeBron James, for as much of a physical marvel as he's seen, and he's certainly one of the most unique physical players we've ever seen, he has photographic memory. He can remember a play he ran from 6 years ago. Eric Spoelstra talked about it all the time. He can run down everything he did in an entire game. It takes special intellect and a special gift to be able to do that. That's rarely talked about. And a lot of times when white athletes are talked about, they go to intelligence first and making it seem as if they've had to overcome physical liabilities just to compete with these Black dudes. So it's unfortunate and it's a problem. And even, I would say beyond with how Black athletes are discussed is even how they're presented. I mean, an issue that for a while that we had at ESPN, and I'm glad a senior editor put a stop to it, is the pictures we were running of Serena Williams versus Maria Sharapova. All the pictures of Serena were of her looking overly muscular, and I mean, she's obviously a muscular woman, but looking angry and very threatening and intimidating. Meanwhile, you're running pictures of, Maria Sharapova like eating some ice cream. It was just like there was a message being sent without something being overtly said. And that's why I brought up the diversity issues that are significant in today's newsrooms. That's how that happens. And even whether it's people who write about athletes or even people who talk about athletes, that happens because there's not enough diversity in those spaces.
Hi, thank you, Ms. Hill, for coming. My name is Hannibal Hobson. I'm a recent graduate. And my question speaks to, I often, whenever we have events at George Washington, I'm often really excited because it's like, great, we're here, we're able to learn, so many great things and hear so many very insightful opinions from people. But we also have that advantage being at George Washington in an academic setting where we can throw diversity summits. So my question really speaks more to business, right, as a whole, right, because George Washington ultimately is a business and so is ESPN. And so like these questions about the journalism, sports journalism world, right, could ultimately be about business potentially. So my question is, with your project and also Mr. LeBron James' project, More Than an Athlete, what are your thoughts on the most recent Clutch Sports agent signee being kind of pushed into the business realm, being pushed into New Balance for an internship while also, potentially working on his game obviously every day, but it being something, right, more than sports that, is pushing him into a field that is, strictly about business in a sense.
I can't remember the young man's name. He's a top basketball recruit. And essentially the story is he chose not to go to college and participate in that sham of a one and done rule. And instead, they were able to maneuver it so that he got an internship at New Balance that would pay him $1 million. And it was a significant development because, as you all know, when it comes to the revenue sports, in football and basketball, there are stipulations about when they can make their money. And they'd rather them go to college and be exploited than actually go make their money. And so this was a way to circumvent that. And it was very eye-opening because suddenly I think there will probably be some light bulbs that go off where rather than go and pretend that they want to be on campus for a year, that these guys will find a way to make money immediately, as they should. And the NCAA, who I have a number of issues with, when you see these stories about athletes being paid or asking for money or all those things, the NCAA is to blame for that, for creating this underground economy. The fact that they won't share any of this money, this $1 billion money. I mean, it was, when amateur sports started, it was not with the intent that one day it would be a $13 billion industry and you'd have television contracts and all these other added revenue streams. It was never intended to be that. But the NCAA would like to keep all the money. And that's why they're in the situation that they're in. So whenever I see a coach lose his job, as what happened here recently, although for different reasons, talking about in Maryland, whenever I see these violations and those kind of pay-for-play scandals happening, I just chuckle because the chickens have come home to roost. And sooner or later, a lot of these players are going to start to realize that they are the business, that the NCAA and colleges need them more so than the other way around. And so they're going to get really creative about ways they can circumvent this process. As it is, they can go overseas instead of going to college if they want. Now you see the G League, they have upped the salary so that if you want to go from college to the G League and make $125,000 your first year, you can do that. Mm-hmm. And so they are basically creating a system in which they're going to figure out a way to leave them out of it. Since the NCAA decided to be so greedy and to cut them out the pie, I think the characters and the athletes involved are going to do the same thing, and we'll see what happens. But they better wisen up and try to figure out a way to equitably compensate these athletes. Otherwise, their entire system is going to crumble.
Hi, my name is Freddie. I'm a junior here. Sorry if you touched on this a little bit earlier. I got here a little bit late. I had class. But so a conversation that I've been having with a lot of Black students on campus recently, especially as I started taking more creative classes, creative writing, poetry courses, etc. It's about being your truest self in the classroom, bringing your Black experiences, your Black perspective into the classroom. And do you feel comfortable doing that, even if your teacher or your professor may not have the brain capacity or the experiences or the empathy to kind of understand where you're coming from, or to properly grade you, or to even give you constructive criticism? And a lot of times we don't know, especially when it comes down to a lot of us want to go to law school, med school, your GPA is very important. So when you're dealing with this kind of superiority complex, not they're superior in humanity, but in status or title, kind of how do you go about being your truest self? You talk about shut up and dribble, coming from somebody that's superior in status, or I can only imagine a media outlet like an ESPN. Just kind of how do you navigate or tell somebody just to be your truest self, don't matter about the consequences, bring your full self, all of your experiences, kind of into whatever it is that you're doing? Because I've just been having this conversation almost every day lately.
Yeah, so one, it depends on who is your full self. Yeah, and I really mean that because, when you're your full, part of being your full self is taking whatever you may know intellectually, combining that with your experiences that, you've just had in your everyday life, and also keeping in mind what it is that you want to, accomplish. Along the way, the higher you go and as you gain more leverage, especially when you're starting out, there just are going to have to be certain compromises you make. And you have to decide which compromises are worth it and which one of those, and which compromises aren't. I always say never do anything or participate in anything that sacrifices your dignity. Your dignity is not up for debate, okay? Your dignity nor your humanity, those two things are never up for debate. So hold tight to those. I will say that even in being your full self, you have to allow yourself to be open-minded and to learn from others and even from the environment that you're in. Because a lot of times people think being their full self is I'm always right. Sometimes you're not. And so you have to allow for yourself to be taught and in those environments that you can grow and you can learn from as well. But as you go through life, and especially if you plan to be participating in corporate America, understand that there's gonna be some fish you're gonna have to let swim by. And there's gonna have to be some battles that you decide not to take. But the ones you do take, make sure they're really worth it. And those are battles that you are willing to take all the way so that you don't feel like you've compromised your dignity or humanity over them. So it's just a balance. I mean, that's just life. So it's not, I'm not saying anything that's not, that's new or earth shattering, because there are certain battles that I'll pick up as a year 21 career journalist that I wouldn't have picked up in year 5. But that's because I have the leverage to do them now as opposed to then. Like there's a reason LeBron James is starting a production company now as opposed to 10 years ago. He knows he has the leverage. He knows that he has the star power, that he can get anything done that he wants to get done now. LeBron 10 years ago wouldn't have called the president a bum. LeBron today can call the president a bum. See what I'm saying? It's like, that's what I mean about, like you mentioned navigating, is that understanding what your leverage is and what you can accomplish with that leverage. Because there'll come a time where you're gonna have a lot of leverage, and then that's when you're gonna be able to do even more than you would have ever thought possible. But step one is getting that leverage.
Thank you.
So we have time for one more question, but what I will share, because I see that there's a few people in the back, Jemele is going to join us for our reception afterwards and has said that she's more than willing to engage with folks, take pictures, answer additional questions. So I just want folks who are lined up to feel reassured by that this is not like cut off, but we do want to make sure that people are able to exit and enjoy the reception and have more of a one-to-one experience with Jemele. So the last question, thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Shalise. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan.
All right,
Went to high school.
What up, though?
Hey. But when I was 6 years old, my family moved to Jackson, Mississippi.
We still claim you.
I do too. I do all the time. But believe it or not, those two places have a lot more in common than people would think.
They do.
In Mississippi, I'm a co-host for a podcast called Red Flag, which is about the history and momentum to change the Mississippi state flag, which is the only flag in the country to still have the Confederate emblem on it. So what would you say to people who would, I'll say, refute that Confederate white supremacist history that we memorialize is not problematic? How would you address those and kind of navigate that conversation of how do we talk about history? There are a lot of things that are in place, a lot of structures. I'm thinking of Charlottesville and things that have happened in the last few years. How would you navigate that conversation and talk to people about it?
Well, one, I don't go into those conversations anymore willing to negotiate, if you will. And I think what has happened is that there's a lot of people being intellectually lazy and intellectually dishonest. It was funny for me, you mentioned you're from, or were born in Detroit, I'm from there. Kid Rock is waving a Confederate flag. Kid Rock wasn't born in the South. Kid Rock was born in Michigan. All right. So what are you waving why are you waving this Confederate flag? The people who are standing by the legacy of the Confederacy, you're standing by the legacy of traitors. Okay. That's number one. And two, they're only clinging to that because they're being told no. Because that's really what it's about. It's almost when we get into this inane conversation about the N-word, is that people don't like being told they can't use something or they can't do something or that something isn't right. Because there is so much historical evidence that shows they are wrong. So I always approach those conversations from the standpoint of they're just being willfully ignorant, which is why it doesn't bother me as much, because they want to double down on that. And even though history has shown them to be completely wrong, I mean, it's kind of where we are with, for example, immigration, despite mountains of evidence that suggests that no, undocumented immigrants aren't here wildly committing crimes, and all the things we know to be true about this migrant caravan, and that seeking asylum is completely legal. Despite knowing those facts, there are still people out there who willingly want to be ignorant, and they only want to be ignorant because they want their emotions to be facts. You know, the whole problem with challenging institutional racism is that to really explore what it means, and especially in the context of white privilege, to admit such thing as white privilege is a real thing for some people means that you were complicit in the system. And that's why that conversation often goes nowhere. So if I were you, I wouldn't really, of course, continue to educate and inform and those kinds of things, but I don't like to debate stupid. I don't have the time for it. So the people who don't want to get it really just don't want to get it because there's nothing that supports their position.
So with November 6th approaching, I mean, you spent some time at the podium talking about the election and the importance of your vote and the experience that you had with your vote. And I want to just capture one quote that I think you actually tweeted recently. And you said, if your vote didn't matter, why are they trying to suppress it? And so I just want to give you the opportunity in the last minute or so to share any words, particularly with a college-age community, about the significance of voting. For some, this could be the first time voting in this capacity. So just giving you some space to end on that note.
So I'm sure you've seen like a lot of, I believe it might be Andrew Gillum, but I've seen a lot of politicians, I feel like, say this. The slogan, when we vote, we win. And the reason why gerrymandering and voter suppression, while those things, they've always existed, but I think especially in the last 5 to 6 years, you've seen an intense focus on that happening. Landmark cases being fought all across this country to either continue it or to stop it. It's because they know that the secret weapon is you. You're the secret weapon. Because you look at the percentages of the people who vote and the people who don't vote. And if young people, if people of color showed up at the polls, this country would look so much different. Because right now, the people that vote are people who are significantly older, who have a much different view of the world than what you have of it right now. And they're voting to keep in place what they know, because they're afraid of what they don't know. We also know what's going to happen in a few years when this demographic changes, and they're afraid of what that means. So right now, what you're seeing to me is the last stand of white supremacy. And I don't know how long the stand is going to last, because to say last means that, you know, there won't be some other reinvention, but it's the last stand of it because there is this fear of what happens when all of a sudden the majority is no longer the majority. So that's why I said that on Twitter, is that, you know, if your vote really didn't matter, if your voice didn't matter, then why are they so trying so hard to keep you from the polls? I mean, even with the way we vote, it's as if we still think we're 13 colonies. It's like, what are we doing, you know? And so that's why I think it's more than important that you be stubborn about this and not let them take you out of this process because they don't want your views represented. I mean, I don't know if any of you had this thought, but when those hearings were going on with Brett Kavanaugh, I was looking at the leadership that is questioning him and trying to get to the bottom of what's going on. And I was just thinking, I cannot believe these people got elected. But they got elected because a lot of people in those areas didn't think their voice or their vote mattered. You know, that's how you wound up with somebody like Jesse Helms being in office as long as he did. That's how you wind up with Lindsey Graham. That's how you wind up with obvious white supremacists in office. That's how it happens. So even though it may seem as if I'm being dramatic or, you know, the coverage is being dramatic, but this is literally what's at stake. And so when I've heard people characterize these elections as being our opportunity to decide what kind of nation we are, they're not lying. Because if you don't get out there and vote, everything you hear and see that's happening now, you're gonna get it and triple it. So just think about that. I know DC obviously is in a different situation, but with your friends and your family that you know, you cannot impress this message on them enough. Because I've told you how much Stacey Abrams is leading in the race right now. she has Oprah, Common, like a ton of celebrities are coming there. Michael B. Jordan going door to door. She had to do all that just to get a 1% lead. So what does that tell you about how people have basically underestimated what this means? And she's had to pull out all the stops to overcome somebody who's suppressed 340,000 votes. So if she actually won this race, it would be the very definition of something that people of color have heard forever, which is you have to be twice as good. In her case, she would have had to have been 25 times as good to actually win this race. That should tell you something about what they fear.
So GW, join me in thanking Jemele Hill for being here today.